The blizzard hit Pembina County, North Dakota at 3 o'clock in the afternoon on January 12, 1888. One moment the sky was merely gray and threatening. The next moment the world disappeared into a wall of white. Wind screamed across the prairie at 70 miles per hour, driving snow so thick that a man standing at arm's length became invisible. Temperature plunged from 10 degrees above zero to 35 degrees below in less than 2 hours. This was not a storm. This was a killer. Across the county, ranchers frantically tried to get their cattle into shelter. Cows scattered in panic, running blindly into the blinding snow. Many animals never made it to the barns. Those that did found structures overwhelmed. Doors blocked by drifting snow, interior temperatures dropping rapidly despite the supposed protection of wooden walls. The blizzard lasted 43 hours. When it finally cleared on January 14th, the devastation was total. Thomas Carlson's ranch, 5 miles east of Pembina, lost 112 head out of 140. Nearly 80% of his herd, frozen in drifts or dead in his barn, where the cold penetrated despite every effort to keep them warm. James Henderson lost 96 of 120. Martin Schultz lost all 73 of his cattle. Not a single animal survived. The economic destruction was catastrophic. Ranchers who'd spent years building their herds were bankrupt overnight. But on one ranch, 3 miles south of Cavalier, a German immigrant named Friedrich Adler walked into his buried cattle shelter on the morning of January 15th and found all 68 of his cattle alive, healthy, and calmly chewing hay. The temperature in his underground barn was 42 degrees Fahrenheit, 77 degrees warmer than the outside air. Not a single animal showed signs of cold stress. Not one had frostbite. Every cow, bull, and calf in his herd had survived the worst blizzard in a generation without injury. His neighbors had called the buried shelter stupid. They'd said Friedrich was wasting a year of labor digging a hole in the ground when he should have been building a proper barn above ground like everyone else. They'd predicted the structure would flood in spring, collapse under its own weight, or suffocate the animals with bad air. They'd offered pity, assuming Friedrich would learn an expensive lesson when his foolish underground barn failed. Instead, on January 15, 1888, Friedrich had 68 living cattle, while his neighbors walked fields counting frozen corpses. The difference was not luck. It was not divine intervention. It was engineering. It was understanding heat loss and temperature stability. It was a buried shelter that everyone called stupid until it became the only thing that worked. This is the story of how one farmer's childhood memory of German root cellars, combined with systematic observation, created the most thermally stable livestock shelter anyone had built. How going down instead of up solved problems that conventional construction couldn't. And how what looked like a year of wasted labor digging a hole became the template for survival ranching in the most extreme climate in America. Friedrich Adler was born in 1854 in Bavaria, Germany, in a small farming village near the Austrian border. His family grew potatoes, turnips, and other root vegetables, storing their harvest in large underground cellars. These kellers, as they were called, were dug deep into hillsides with thick earth walls and roofs. The temperature inside stayed remarkably stable year-round, cool enough in summer to prevent spoilage, warm enough in winter to prevent freezing. As a child, Friedrich spent hours in these underground chambers, hauling vegetables in fall and retrieving them in winter. He noticed how the temperature never varied much, regardless of outside weather. How in summer, when the surface temperature was 80 degrees, the cellar was 55. How in winter, when it was 10 below outside, the cellar was still 55. The earth, he realized, held a constant temperature at depth. The deeper you went, the more stable it became. Friedrich immigrated to America in 1876 at age 22, seeking land and opportunity. He worked railroad construction for 4 years, saved his wages, and in 1880 filed a homestead claim in Pembina County, North Dakota Territory. The land was flat prairie with deep, rich soil, perfect for farming. The climate was brutal. Summer heat exceeded 100 degrees. Winter cold dropped to 40 below. The extremes were far more severe than anything Friedrich had experienced in Bavaria. He proved up his claim, and by 1884 had established a small ranch. 20 head of cattle, a modest cabin, and a conventional barn built from logs hauled from the Pembina River Valley. The barn was well constructed by frontier standards, with thick log walls, a sod roof, and a solid door. It should have been adequate. The winter of 1884 to 1885 taught Friedrich otherwise. During a cold wave in February, temperatures dropped to 40 below and stayed there for a week. His barn, despite having a fire burning in a barrel stove, could barely maintain 20 degrees inside. The cattle suffered. 3 animals died from cold stress. The survivors showed frostbite on ears and tails. Friedrich spent the week hauling firewood and tending the fire, but the barn was simply too large and too poorly insulated to heat adequately. He started thinking about alternatives. A conventional barn had too much volume. The heat from the stove rose to the high ceiling and escaped through the roof. The walls, even thick logs, conducted cold inward. The door, opened multiple times daily to tend the animals, let in blasts of frigid air. Everything about conventional barn design worked against maintaining stable temperatures in extreme cold. Friedrich remembered the German cellars, underground, surrounded by earth. Stable temperature year-round. What if he built a barn underground? Not just partially buried, but fully underground, dug deep into the earth where temperature was constant. The idea seemed extreme, but the alternative, losing cattle every winter to cold, was unacceptable. In the spring of 1885, Friedrich began planning. He would dig a large underground chamber, big enough to house his growing herd. The structure would be 12 feet deep, 40 feet long, and 20 feet wide. The excavation would be massive. Thousands of cubic yards of earth to remove, but if it worked, he would have a shelter that needed no heating, yet stayed warm all winter. He mentioned the plan to his neighbor, Thomas Carlson, in June. Carlson's reaction was immediate and negative. "You want to bury your cattle in a hole in the ground?" "Not bury, house them. In underground barn." "Friedrich, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. Cattle need air. They need light. Bury them underground and they'll suffocate or panic, and even if they don't suffocate, you'll have a hole full of moisture and manure. It'll be unhealthy and impossible to maintain." It was German cellars work for vegetables. Underground barn can work for cattle. Vegetables don't breathe like cattle do. Vegetables don't produce body heat and moisture. You're going to dig yourself a grave for your herd. Carlson rode away shaking his head, convinced Friedrich was making a terrible mistake. Word spread quickly through the ranching community. That German fellow was planning to bury his cattle, dig a huge hole, and keep his animals underground like they were potatoes. The general consensus was that Friedrich had lost his mind. A rancher named James Henderson rode over specifically to try to talk Friedrich out of the plan. He found Friedrich surveying the site he'd chosen for excavation, a slight rise in the prairie with good drainage. "Friedrich, I heard about your underground barn idea. As your neighbor, I feel obligated to tell you this is a bad plan. A very bad plan." "Why is bad?" Friedrich asked. "First, the labor. You're talking about digging out 8,000 cubic yards of earth. That's a year of back-breaking work. Second, the structure. How will you prevent collapse? How will you support the roof? Third, the animals. Cattle aren't meant to live underground. They need natural light, fresh air, reasonable temperatures. Fourth, the moisture. Underground means groundwater seepage. You'll have a wet, muddy hole instead of a dry shelter." Friedrich listened patiently. Then he responded, "I work hard. Labor is not problem. For structure, I use timber supports like in mine. For animals, They need warm more than they need light. Fresh air, I make vents. For moisture, I dig below water table and use drainage. Henderson tried another approach. Even if you solve all those problems, you're spending a year building one experimental shelter when you could spend 3 weeks building a proven conventional barn. If your underground shelter fails, you've wasted a year and endangered your herd. If a conventional barn fails, at least you followed accepted methods and can't be blamed for the failure. If conventional barn fails, cattle die. I can be blamed for that. Henderson left, frustrated by Friedrich's stubbornness. The community sentiment was unanimous. Friedrich's buried cattle shelter was a stupid idea that would fail expensively. When it did fail, everyone hoped Friedrich wouldn't lose too many animals in the process. Friedrich began excavation in June of 1885. He started by removing the topsoil and sod from the entire site, creating a rectangle 40 feet by 20 feet. Then he began digging down. The prairie soil was dense and heavy. Each shovelful weighed 15 pounds. Friedrich dug for 10 to 12 hours a day, removing the earth bucket by bucket, wheelbarrow by wheelbarrow. After 2 weeks, he dug down 3 feet across the entire area. The excavation already represented enormous labor. He was just getting started. He dug through 4 feet, then 5 feet, then 6 feet. The walls of the excavation were nearly vertical, cut clean and straight. At 6 feet depth, he reached the local water table. Water began seeping into the bottom of his pit. This was critical. Friedrich needed to go deeper, but couldn't dig below the water table without the excavation flooding. His solution was drainage. He dug a deep trench from the center of his excavation to a low point 200 feet away. The trench, 4 feet deep and 2 feet wide, created a path for groundwater to flow away from the shelter site. It took him another week to dig this drainage trench, but once completed, the water level in his main excavation dropped. With drainage established, Friedrich continued digging down. 7 feet, 8 feet, 9 feet. The walls were now so tall that hauling earth out required a pulley system. Friedrich rigged up a simple crane with a wooden arm and a rope. He filled buckets at the bottom, hoisted them to the surface, dumped them, and sent the buckets back down. The process was slow and exhausting. By late August, he'd reached 12 feet depth. The excavation was complete. He'd removed approximately 8,000 cubic yards of earth over 10 weeks of continuous labor. His neighbors, who rode by to check on progress, were amazed by the scale. The hole was enormous, a rectangular pit that dominated his property. It looked like he was mining for gold rather than building a cattle shelter. Now came the structural phase. Friedrich couldn't simply leave the pit with open walls and call it a barn. He needed to reinforce the walls to prevent collapse and build a roof structure to cover the space. For the walls, he used a technique borrowed from mining. He cut logs into 8-foot lengths and positioned them vertically against the earth walls, creating a timber facing. Cross braces connected these vertical timbers, holding them in place. The result was a wooden retaining wall that prevented the earth from caving in while still allowing the earth to provide insulation. The roof structure was the biggest engineering challenge. It needed to span 20 feet, support the weight of earth that would be piled on top, and create a weather-tight seal. Friedrich built a series of massive timber trusses, each one crafted from logs 10 inches in diameter. He spaced these trusses every 4 feet along the 40-foot length of the shelter. Each truss required careful notching and fitting. Each one weighed several hundred pounds and required a team of horses to position. Once the trusses were in place, Friedrich laid heavy planks across them, creating a solid deck. Over the planks went a layer of tar paper for waterproofing. Then he began covering the roof deck with earth. Not just a thin layer, but 3 feet of soil piled on top. This earth layer would provide insulation, protecting the shelter from temperature extremes above. Thomas Carlson visited in September and stared at the construction. The trusses looked strong, but the weight they would carry seemed impossible. "That roof is going to collapse. 3 feet of earth. That's what, 4 tons per truss? Those timbers can't hold that." "I calculate load. Timbers are strong enough. Earth weight spread across many trusses. Even if it doesn't collapse immediately, the first heavy snow will add more weight. Or spring rain will saturate that earth, making it even heavier. Something's going to give." Friedrich didn't argue. He simply continued his work, piling earth on the roof until the entire structure was covered. From the surface, the buried shelter was nearly invisible. Just a slight mound with a single entrance, a heavy timber door at one end that opened onto a ramp, leading down into the underground space. By mid-October, the basic structure was complete. Friedrich added the final details: ventilation shafts extending from the ceiling to the surface, allowing fresh air to enter and stale air to escape. A drainage channel in the floor sloping toward the exit ramp, allowing moisture to flow out. Wooden mangers along both walls for feeding. A gravel floor that would provide drainage and relatively dry footing. The first test came in late October when Friedrich moved his 20 cattle into the new shelter. The animals hesitated at the entrance, balking at the dark ramp leading underground. But with patience and encouragement, Friedrich got them inside. Once in the chamber, the cattle seemed calm. The space was dark, lit only by 2 small ventilation shafts that allowed minimal light. But the temperature was noticeably warmer than outside, 55 degrees underground compared to 40 degrees above ground. Friedrich monitored the animals closely over the next days. He checked for signs of respiratory distress that would indicate poor air quality. He looked for behavioral problems that might suggest stress from the underground environment. He found neither. The cattle adapted quickly. They ate normally, rested peacefully, and showed no ill effects from being housed below ground. As November brought colder weather, the temperature difference between surface and underground became more pronounced. On a day when the outside temperature was 20 degrees, the shelter held at 52 degrees, a 32-degree difference maintained with no heating whatsoever. The earth surrounding the shelter acted as a massive insulator, preventing the cold from penetrating. James Henderson visited in December, curious despite his skepticism. Friedrich gave him a tour, leading him down the ramp into the underground chamber. Henderson stepped into the space and immediately felt the temperature difference. It was genuinely warm, not just warmer than outside, actually comfortable. The cattle lay peacefully in the straw bedding, chewing cud, completely at ease. "I admit it's warmer than I expected," Henderson said, "but we haven't had real cold yet. Wait until January. Wait until 40 below. Then we'll see if this buried hole can keep cattle alive." January will prove it works or prove I am wrong. We will see. Henderson climbed back out, still skeptical but less certain of Friedrich's failure. The shelter was undeniably warmer than any barn he'd seen. Whether it was warm enough to survive extreme cold remained to be tested. December brought temperatures in the single digits and below zero. Friedrich's buried shelter maintained temperatures between 48 and 52 degrees. His cattle remained healthy and comfortable. Neighboring ranchers, heating their barns with stoves and still struggling to maintain 30 degrees inside, began to notice. Friedrich's animals looked better, showed less stress, required no supplemental heating, but the real test was yet to come. The blizzard that would define the winter of 1887 to 1888 was building in the Arctic, a massive system of cold air and moisture that would sweep across the northern plains in January. When it hit, it would test every structure, every preparation, every decision made during the previous year. The storm arrived on January 12th. The temperature dropped violently. The wind rose to terrifying speeds. Snow fell so thick it was impossible to see. Ranchers across Pembina County fought desperate battles to save their herds. They drove cattle toward barns, but many animals panicked and ran into the storm. Those that made it to shelter found barns overwhelmed, doors blocked by drifting snow, temperatures plummeting despite fires burning in stoves. Thomas Carlson spent the first day of the blizzard desperately trying to keep his cattle alive. He burned wood at an unsustainable rate, trying to maintain heat in his barn. But the cold was too extreme. The barn, built above ground with log walls, couldn't hold heat. The temperature inside dropped to 10 degrees even, with a fire roaring. His cattle huddled together, but hudding wasn't enough. By the end of the first day, 20 had died from hypothermia. The blizzard raged through the night and into the second day. Carlson's fire went out when his wood supply stored outside became unreachable behind 12-foot drifts. Without heat, the barn temperature dropped to 0. More cattle died. By the morning of January 14th, when the storm finally cleared, Carlson had lost 112 of his 140 cattle, 80% of his herd dead from cold in a barn that was supposed to protect them. The devastation extended across the county. Every rancher who'd kept cattle in conventional barns had suffered massive losses. James Henderson lost 96 of 120. Martin Schultz lost all 73. The economic impact was staggering. Years of work building herds gone in 2 days. The emotional toll was crushing. Ranchers who thought they'd prepared adequately found that adequacy wasn't enough against this storm. Friedrich had spent the storm in his cabin, unable to reach his buried shelter through the blinding snow. He worried about his cattle, but could do nothing. The entrance to the shelter was potentially buried under drifts. The ventilation shafts might be blocked by snow. The animals might be suffocating or freezing despite the insulation. He wouldn't know until the storm cleared and he could dig his way to the entrance. On the morning of January 15th, Friedrich dressed in every warm layer he owned and went outside. The world was transformed. Snow drifts reached 15 feet in some places. His cabin was half buried. The landscape was unrecognizable. He found the approximate location of his shelter entrance and began digging. The snow was packed hard by the wind. He shoveled for an hour before exposing the heavy timber door. He pulled the door open and descended the ramp into darkness. His lantern illuminated the chamber. All 68 of his cattle were alive. They stood or lay peacefully, chewing hay from the mangers, completely unaware of the catastrophe that had occurred above them. The thermometer Friedrich had hung on the wall read 42 degrees. The temperature inside the shelter had remained stable throughout the 43-hour blizzard. Friedrich felt his knees go weak. He'd hoped the shelter would work. He'd believed it would work. But facing the reality of 68 living animals, when his neighbors had lost nearly everything, was overwhelming. His stupid buried shelter had saved his entire herd. Thomas Carlson learned of Friedrich's success on January 16th. After spending 2 days counting and burying his dead cattle, he heard from another rancher that Friedrich had lost none. 0. Carlson rode over, needing to see for himself. He found Friedrich clearing snow from the ventilation shafts. "I heard your cattle survived," Carlson said without preamble. "All survived, all healthy." "How?" "It was 40 below. My barn was heated and I still lost most of my herd." "How did an unheated hole in the ground keep cattle alive when heated barns failed?" Friedrich led Carlson to the entrance and down the ramp. The chamber was dim but warm. The cattle looked healthy, calm, entirely untroubled by the recent storm. Carlson touched the wall, feeling the earth behind the timber facing. He checked the thermometer. 42 degrees. His barn, with a fire burning, had been colder than this. "I don't understand," Carlson said. "No fire, no heat source, just earth and timber. How is it 42 degrees in here?" "The earth at depth stays same temperature always. In summer, maybe 55 degrees. In winter, 55 degrees. Build shelter at that depth. And temperature inside stays close to earth temperature. Storm above makes no difference. Cold. Cannot reach 12 feet deep." So while my barn was losing heat through every wall and roof surface, your shelter was maintaining temperature because it's surrounded by earth that doesn't change temperature? Yes, earth is insulation, best insulation, and is also heat source in winter. At 12 feet depth, earth is warmer than air above. Shelter surrounded by earth stays warm. Carlson looked around the chamber again. The principle made sense now that he understood it. The earth wasn't conducting cold inward because the earth itself was warmer than the outside air. The massive thermal mass of thousands of tons of soil surrounding the shelter maintained stable conditions that no amount of surface cold could penetrate quickly. "I called this stupid," Carlson said quietly. "I told everyone you were wasting your time. I predicted failure." Many people said same thing. But you were right. This stupid buried shelter works better than anything else. You didn't lose a single animal. I lost 112. The difference is this shelter. News of Friedrich's perfect survival rate spread through Pembina County within days. The contrast was stark and undeniable. Conventional barns, even well-built ones, had failed catastrophically. The stupid buried shelter had succeeded completely. Ranchers who'd mocked the design now came to see it, to understand how it worked, to ask if they could build their own. If you're fascinated by these revolutionary building techniques that challenged conventional wisdom and saved lives and livelihoods, make sure to subscribe to the channel. We uncover the forgotten innovations of settlers who combined knowledge from different cultures with systematic observation to solve impossible problems. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss these incredible stories of practical genius. Friedrich became an unlikely expert on underground livestock shelters. In late January and through February, he gave tours to dozens of ranchers who wanted to learn the technique. He explained the excavation process, the structural supports, the ventilation system, the drainage design. He answered questions about cost, labor, and maintenance. He shared everything freely, seeing no reason to keep the knowledge proprietary when sharing it could prevent animal deaths. The questions were detailed and practical. How deep did excavation need to go? Friedrich recommended minimum 10 feet, 12 feet better. The deeper you went, the more stable the temperature. What about ventilation? Friedrich showed his system of 4 ventilation shafts, each 6 inches in diameter, positioned at the corners of the chamber. 2 served as fresh air intakes, 2 as exhaust. Natural convection moved air through the system without requiring fans or power. What about moisture control? Friedrich demonstrated his drainage system. The floor sloped slightly toward the exit ramp. A shallow trench collected moisture and manure runoff, channeling it to the outside. The gravel floor provided reasonable footing and allowed minor moisture to percolate through, rather than pooling. The combination kept the shelter dry enough for livestock health. What about structural longevity? Friedrich admitted he couldn't answer that question yet. His shelter was only 2 years old. But the timber supports looked sound. The roof showed no signs of sagging, and the earth walls behind the retaining timbers remained stable. He expected the structure would last at least 20 years, possibly much longer. The most common question was about cost and labor. Building an underground shelter required enormous effort. Friedrich estimated he'd spent 12 weeks on excavation alone, then another 6 weeks on structural work. 18 weeks total, working full-time. The timber and materials cost roughly what a conventional barn cost, but the labor investment was 3 to 4 times greater. But Friedrich pointed out the return on that investment. He'd saved 68 cattle worth approximately $60 each, $4,000 of animals alive because of the shelter. Carlson had lost 112 cattle, $6,700 dead, despite his conventional barn. The extra labor in building the underground shelter had paid for itself many times over in a single storm. By spring of 1888, 7 ranchers in Pembina County had begun excavating underground livestock shelters. The work was backbreaking, but the alternative, Repeating the catastrophic losses of January was unacceptable. Some hired help for the excavation, others worked alone, digging through the summer months, creating chambers that ranged from small, housing 20 animals, to large, housing 100 or more. The designs varied as each builder adapted Friedrich's basic concept to their own circumstances. One rancher built 2 smaller chambers connected by a tunnel rather than one large chamber, believing this would provide better organization and disease control if animals got sick. Another excavated into a hillside rather than flat prairie, reducing the amount of earth that needed to be removed. A third built his chamber only 8 feet deep instead of 12, reducing labor but accepting less temperature stability. All the underground shelters, regardless of variations, shared common features: earth insulation on all sides, heavy timber roof structure, proper ventilation, adequate drainage, and all performed dramatically better than conventional barns when winter returned. The winter of 1888 to 1889 brought another test, not as severe as the previous year's killer blizzard, but cold enough to challenge livestock facilities. Temperatures dropped to 30 below for a week in February. Wind created significant drifting. Conventional barns, even heated ones, struggled to maintain adequate temperatures for animal comfort. The underground shelters performed flawlessly. Interior temperatures remained between 40 and 45 degrees throughout the cold snap. Cattle showed no stress. Feed consumption remained normal. No animals were lost to cold. The ranchers who'd invested the labor in building underground facilities felt vindicated. Those who had stuck with conventional barns were already planning their own underground construction for the following summer. By 1890, underground livestock shelters had become common across the northern plains. The specific design originated with Friedrich Adler, spread throughout North Dakota, northern Minnesota, and southern Manitoba. Agricultural extension agents documented the structures and published construction guidelines. County fairs featured displays explaining the physics of earth-sheltered livestock housing. A professor from the University of Minnesota, Dr. Harold Whitmore, visited Friedrich's shelter in 1891 to study its thermal performance. Whitmore spent a week taking measurements, recording temperatures at different depths in the earth, comparing inside versus outside conditions under various weather scenarios. His findings validated Friedrich's empirical observations. At 12 feet depth, the earth temperature remained stable at 53 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, varying less than 3 degrees throughout the annual cycle. The shelter interior, surrounded by this constant temperature earth, maintained temperatures between 42 and 55 degrees, depending on outside conditions and animal load. The thermal mass of the surrounding earth resisted temperature change, creating remarkable stability. Whitmore calculated that the earth walls provided insulation equivalent to an R value of approximately 45. A conventional wood barn wall, even well-built, provided perhaps R10 to R12. The underground shelter walls were 4 times more insulating than the best above-ground construction. Additionally, the shelter had no air infiltration. Conventional barns, with their inevitable gaps and cracks, lost significant heat to wind-driven air exchange. The underground shelter, sealed by earth on all sides, had essentially zero air infiltration. Whitmore published his findings in an agricultural journal, bringing academic credibility to what had been dismissed as a farmer's odd experiment. His article provided the scientific explanation for why Friedrich's stupid buried shelter worked so well. The paper was widely distributed and helped accelerate adoption of underground livestock housing across the northern United States and Canada. The technique's spread was helped by the obvious economic advantages. A rancher with an underground shelter could maintain a healthy herd with minimal heating expense, no fuel costs for warming. Lower feed requirements because animals weren't burning calories, just staying warm. Higher survival rates during extreme weather. The cumulative economic benefit was substantial. Environmental benefits also became apparent. Ranchers with underground shelters burned far less wood or coal for heating. This reduced smoke pollution and decreased pressure on local forests. The shelter's passive temperature control meant no fossil fuel consumption, making them early examples of sustainable livestock management, though that terminology didn't exist at the time. The social impact was perhaps most significant. Ranchers who'd lost their entire herds in the 1888 blizzard faced bankruptcy and ruin. Those who'd built underground shelters maintained their economic viability. The difference between underground and above-ground housing was literally the difference between staying in business and losing everything. Communities that adopted underground shelters maintained their agricultural economy. Those that didn't suffered lasting economic damage. Friedrich himself continued ranching successfully into the early 20th century. His herd grew from 68 animals in 1888 to over 200 by 1900. The original underground shelter served for 26 years before he built a second, larger chamber to house his expanded herd. The first chamber remained structurally sound when he decommissioned it in 1914, validating his expectation of multi-decade longevity. His sons, Wilhelm and Heinrich, grew up working in underground shelters and considered them normal. When they established their own ranches in the early 1900s, they built underground facilities from the start, never considering conventional above-ground barns. The knowledge passed generationally, becoming part of the family's ranching tradition. Before we continue with the long-term legacy of this innovation, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. These stories of practical problem-solving contain lessons that remain relevant for anyone interested in sustainable agriculture, thermal engineering, or understanding how individual ingenuity can change an entire industry's practices. Don't miss these fascinating historical insights. The early 20th century brought challenges to underground shelter adoption. As technology advanced, artificial heating became more sophisticated. Petroleum-based heaters could warm conventional barns effectively. Electric lighting made underground darkness less problematic. Modern ventilation systems solved air quality issues. These technological solutions reduced the relative advantage of earth-sheltered construction. But in the coldest regions, underground shelters retained their value. Technology could fail, power could go out, fuel could become unavailable. Earth insulation worked regardless of technological systems. During periods of equipment failure or fuel shortages, underground shelters provided reliable protection that technology-dependent conventional barns couldn't match. The Great Depression of the 1930s renewed interest in underground livestock shelters. Farmers facing economic hardship couldn't afford expensive heating fuel. Underground shelters offered warmth without ongoing energy costs. Several agricultural extension services in northern states promoted earth-sheltered livestock housing as a Depression-era survival strategy. The technique had proven economic resilience during the worst financial crisis in American history. World War II brought another practical test. Fuel rationing made heating conventional barns difficult. Farmers with underground shelters maintained normal operations, while those dependent on purchased fuel struggled. The government agricultural agencies recognized this advantage and published updated construction guides for underground livestock facilities, promoting them as part of the war effort to maximize food production with minimal resource use. By mid-century, underground livestock shelters had become an established, though not universal, practice across the northern plains. Estimates suggest perhaps 15 to 20% of ranches in North Dakota, northern Minnesota, and southern Manitoba used some form of earth-sheltered livestock housing. The specific design varied considerably, but all followed Friedrich's fundamental principle: surround animals with earth to maintain stable temperatures. Friedrich Adler died in 1933 at age 79. His obituary in the Cavalier Chronicle credited him with pioneering underground livestock shelter design and noted that his innovation had helped thousands of ranchers survive the brutal winters of the northern plains. The article estimated that shelters built using his principles had saved tens of thousands of cattle from cold-related death over the decades since 1888. The original shelter, built in 1885, was finally decommissioned in 1953 when Friedrich's grandson converted the ranch to crop farming. Before filling in the excavation, the grandson documented the structure with photographs and measurements. After 68 years of use, the timber supports remained largely sound. The roof had never collapsed. The drainage system still functioned. The structure had exceeded even Friedrich's optimistic predictions for longevity. Modern agricultural engineering has rediscovered principles that Friedrich understood intuitively. Contemporary studies of earth-sheltered livestock housing confirm that properly designed underground facilities provide superior thermal stability with minimal energy input. The physics haven't changed. Earth at 10 to 12 feet depth maintains constant temperature. Structures surrounded by that earth inherit temperature stability. The advantage is as real today as it was in 1885. Some modern sustainable agriculture practitioners have built earth-sheltered livestock facilities inspired by historical examples like Friedrich's. These contemporary structures often incorporate modern materials like concrete and synthetic insulation. But the fundamental design, excavation to stable earth temperature with adequate ventilation and drainage, remains unchanged from Friedrich's original. Environmental building advocates recognize earth-sheltered livestock housing as an early example of passive environmental control. Using the Earth's thermal properties to maintain comfort without energy input anticipated modern green building principles by over a century. Friedrich was practicing sustainable agriculture before sustainability became a recognized goal. The story of Friedrich's stupid buried cattle shelter offers enduring lessons. First, conventional design is not always optimal design. Everyone built barns above ground because that's what everyone did. The tradition was strong, but the logic was weak. Friedrich questioned the tradition and found a better solution. Second, understanding physical principles trumps following accepted practice. Friedrich understood that Earth at depth maintains constant temperature. He understood that surrounding animals with constant temperature Earth would create stable interior conditions. The physics worked regardless of what everyone else thought was proper. Third, initial labor investment can yield decades of returns. Friedrich spent 18 weeks building his shelter. That shelter saved his herd repeatedly over 26 years of use. The return on labor investment was extraordinary when calculated over the structure's lifetime. Fourth, learning from other contexts produces innovation. Friedrich borrowed from German root cellars, from mining techniques, from observations about temperature stability. No single source gave him the complete answer. Synthesis across multiple knowledge domains created the solution. Fifth, survival validates methods. The only test that mattered was whether cattle lived or died. Friedrich's 68 cattle lived. His neighbor's cattle died. The survival data ended all arguments about whether underground shelters worked. Finally, individual innovation can change industry practices. Friedrich built one unusual shelter. Within 5 years, hundreds of similar shelters existed across the northern plains. One farmer's stupid idea became an industry standard because it worked better than conventional alternatives. The 68 cattle that survived the January 1888 blizzard proved that buried shelters weren't stupid at all. They were brilliantly engineered solutions to an extreme climate problem. The chamber, dug 12 feet deep, maintained 42 degrees when surface temperature was 35 below. That 77-degree difference was the difference between herd survival and herd destruction. Thomas Carlson, who'd called the buried shelter stupid and predicted failure, rebuilt his ranch operation over several years. In 1890, he excavated his own underground livestock shelter, following Friedrich's design closely. He never again lost cattle to cold. The stupid idea that he'd mocked became the method he relied on for the rest of his ranching career. James Henderson, who'd tried to talk Friedrich out of the project, built an underground shelter in 1889. Martin Schultz, who'd lost all 73 of his cattle in the blizzard, rebuilt his herd slowly and housed them underground from the start. Across Pembina County, the ranchers who'd been most skeptical became the method's strongest advocates once winter demonstrated its effectiveness. The stupid buried cattle shelter that everyone laughed at became the standard that everyone copied. The year of back-breaking excavation that seemed wasteful became an investment that paid returns for decades. The design that violated every convention of barn construction became the template for survival in the coldest climate in America. Friedrich Adler's legacy isn't just the specific shelters he built or the animals he saved. It's the demonstration that individual thinking can overturn collective assumptions, that one person building differently can change how everyone builds, that stupid ideas are sometimes the only smart ideas, and that the difference between disaster and success often comes down to whether you have the courage to dig down when everyone else is building up. The buried shelter worked. The entire herd survived. The stupid idea proved brilliant, and for ranchers across the northern frontier, that made all the difference.